Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings to the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to, by Blue Ontario's Shore, section number 1 of the 20 sections, and we'll right away be challenged by this opening section of this really remarkable poem. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, and then you've been working with us from the very beginning with the inscriptions poems. We're going to reference a couple of those in this lecture, all the way up to and including, obviously, drum taps, as well as memories of President Lincoln. And then a set of introductory comments that I've hoped that you've already studied with me that will set up then our study of this set of lines, especially section number 1. Now, as is always the case, we like to turn to our Nortons to get some background information, and Norton's provides a pretty lengthy set of comments on this poem. It begins by saying the following: in theme and intent, this poem is essentially the poetical equivalent of the 1855 preface. We were making this point in our intro comments, from which in its present form it draws more than 60 of its lines, and many more in the earlier editions. In it, Whitman identifies the purpose of his poetry with the aspiration and potentiality of his country. In it, he presents himself as the bard of his people with a mandate from the muse. This will be the phantom that we will meet in the first section of the opening lines. Of all his poems, Norton's continues, this poem has undergone the most extensive and ceaseless revision. It originated as one of the 20 new poems of the second edition under the title Poem of Many in One, about 1/4 of its then 280 lines being transfers from the 1855 preface. In 1860, it was the opening number 1 of the Chance Democratic, 20 lines being dropped and some 8 added. In Leaves of Grass 1867, the 4th edition, the title became As I Sat Alone by Blue Ontario's Shore, and notable sections were added, the opening one and several others which reflect the poet's experiences and reflections upon the Civil War, and the expanded text and expanded the text to 337 lines. In 1871-76 text, the alterations were far fewer, although the additions brought the poem to 345 lines. Finally, in 1881, the poem took its present title and some 10 lines were dropped, including the interesting observation, which had first appeared in the preceding edition, that, quote, as a wheel turns on its axle, so I find my chance turning finally on the war, end quote. This, of course, takes us back to the wheeled universe, the hub for the wheeled universe of Song of Myself 48, right? And Norton's will suggest that we will take a close look at the different variants of this poem. For example, he will say notes on the preface of 1855 in this volume will indicate some help. So if you're working from the Norton's anthology, I recommend that you go and do that work. Now, Norton's finishes with an observation. A prose paragraph, turned up by Trobel, seems to express, as Whitman agreed, the idea from which the poem originally advanced. Quote, this is Whitman: a song America demands that breathes her native air, an utterance to invigorate democracy, capital D. Democracy, the destined conqueror, yet treacherous lips smile everywhere, and death and infidelity at every step. These are lines from the first section we'll study in a moment. Of such a song let me, for I have had that dream, initiate here the novice's attempt, all capitalized, novice's attempt. And bravos to the bards who coming after me do far better. Then Norton's will tell us about the opening use of the word, the opening line, and he says it this way. In section number 1, first added in the 1867 edition, we should compare this address of the Phantom with its original text, and it ran like this, quote, chant me a poem, it said, of the range of the high soul of poets, and chant of the welcome bards that breathe but my native air. Invoke those bards, and chant me, before you go, the song of the throes of democracy. And as we turn now to the actual set of lines, we'll pay attention to the ways in which those lines we just read will have some echoes here. We'll begin with the color blue, and we've commented already so many times on the way in which Whitman loves to use colors in Leaves of Grass. You'll remember that in Cabin Ships at Sea, it was the boundless blue on every side as he talked about the ocean. And Ontario will be mentioned in Song of Myself 14 for the first time, and then 4 times in this poem, and that's the only times that Ontario will ever get used this way. We'll read now section 1. By blue Ontario's shore, as I mused of these warlike days, end of peace returned, and the dead that return no more. A phantom, gigantic, superb, with stern visage, accosted me. Chant me the poem, it said, that comes from the soul of America. Chant me the carol of victory, and strike up the marches of Libertad, marches more powerful yet, and sing me before you go the song of the throes of democracy. Democracy, the destined conqueror, yet treacherous lip smiles everywhere, and death and infidelity at every step. Now, I find this a fascinating introductory set of lines. Notice we'll begin right away with the idea, again, as we've studied so often, the way Whitman loves his prepositions, and here it's by. By blue Ontario's shore. I like to think that T.S. Eliot learned a whole lot to write Dry Salvages from a poem like this. You'll remember that he will say the sea is the land's edge also, as he's playing that game in the opening lines of Dry Salvages. Go back and take a look at it at learnstrong.net. We've given full lectures on all of the 4 quartets. As I mused of these warlike days, the word mused gets used one time in Leaves of Grass, and it's right here. Although you'll remember the word muse itself, as toilsome I wandered Virginia's woods, long, long I muse. You'll remember that from our drum text study. On these warlike days, this takes us back to starting from Paumanok passage 6, when he used this word warlike for the first time. And of peace returned, and then this observation that we saw several times in drum taps as well as in memories of President Lincoln, the dead that return no more. It's interesting how sometimes he'll argue that the dead return, think of Song of Myself passage 6, that the dead return with the grass, right, with the growing of grass. And then other times like here, we'll be reminded that those who sacrificed for the greatness of America, they're gone. We think, of course, of Lincoln and his Gettysburg Address. Now, all of a sudden, we're going to have the phantom. Now, I want to take us back to As I Pondered in Silence. You'll remember this. This is the second poem, technically, of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. And do you remember in As I Pondered in Silence, it goes like this. As I pondered in silence, returning upon my poems, considering lingering long, a phantom, capital P, a phantom arose before me with distressful aspect, terrible in beauty, age, and power. The genius of poets of old lands, as to me directing like flame its eyes, with finger pointing to many immortal songs and menacing voice. And then italicized, what singest thou? It said. Knowest thou not there is but one theme for ever enduring bards, and that is the theme of war, the fortune of battles, the making of perfect soldiers. Be it so, then, I answered, I, too, haughty shade, also sing war, and a longer and greater one than any waged in my book, with varying fortune, with flight, advance, and retreat, victory deferred and wavering, yet methinks certain, or as good as certain, at the last, the field, the world, for life and death, for the body and for the eternal soul. Lo, I too am come, chanting the chant of battles. I, above all, promote brave soldiers. Just reading these lines, and this will take us obviously back to our very earliest study of Leaves of Grass. I'm always amazed to pick up a poem like Ontario Shore here at the middle and already trending towards the end of Leaves of Grass, how those echoes from those early sets of lines will come back. Notice it's a phantom, gigantic, superb, stern visage, and it will accost him in some way. In other words, it's going to address him. Now, obviously, we've got the invocation of the muse happening in reverse in some powerful way here, right? So, obviously, he's playing around with his Homer and his Virgil, as well as, obviously, his Dante and his Milton, and all of the great epic poems. Notice, again, italicized, chant me the poem. Notice, it's not a poem, it's the poem. Just like that last poem that we studied, This Dust Was Once the Man, here it's the poem. It's it. That comes from the soul of America. Only one time in all Leaves of Grass does the phrase soul of America get used, and it's right here in the deathbed edition, right? soul of America, chant me the carol of victory. Now, of course, this is going to be the dance that Whitman will make throughout Leaves of Grass. Certainly now, in these poems that will follow in the deathbed edition, Drum Taps and Memories of President Lincoln. Was the war a victory or was it a defeat? And the answer, of course, will be complicated, right? Because obviously there's a lot of sacrifice and a lot of loss, which seems to suggest that the war was in fact a failure. And yet, notice here, it's going to be understood as a victory. And strike up the marches for Libertad. This will take us back to starting from Paumanok Passage 3, where this word gets used for the first time. Liberty is somehow personified, right? Marches more powerful yet. So notice, we're not done marching. Again, the sustained theodicy. And sing me before you go. Interesting. The song of the throes of democracy. And again, this will be that whole idea that we picked up with from starting from Paumanok 10, that love, democracy, and religion are the essential ideas, as he will say it. And again, this is his theodicy. That is to say, I'm going to continue to sing about democracy, capital D. But then, in a parenthetics, that we've seen this so often, regularly, these almost like Shakespearean asides, he will then begin again with the word democracy. The destined conqueror, to combat, obviously, the idea that he will have studied in Plato's Republic 9, as we call it, the declension of state passage, as we've given lectures at learnstrong.net about that. Yet notice he says, treacherous lip smiles. You'll remember this use of the word treacherous in a different way in Song of Myself 28. Treacherous tip of me, right, in all of the sexual renderings of that. Here it's treacherous lip smiles. Lip smiles gets used only this time in all Leaves of Grass. Everywhere. In other words, the doubters, we might say. And death and infidelity at every step. By the way, we'll come back to this word infidelity one more time in passage 10 of this poem, the years striding towards infidelity. This idea of truth and trust and fidelity all will begin then this really celebration of the poet, the bard, the muse who will speak and sing the songs of democracy. Well, I think that this is the key here already, that the poet is the key to democracy. That is to say, the poet is the one that challenges us to remember, creative remembering we might call it, and therefore a sustained theodicy. Not why did this happen to us, but rather why did this happen for us. That will be foundational, I think, to our study of Leaves of Grass, as we've said a number of times. Well, of course, we've got the phantom here, the muse, right, speaking, which is in some ways the invocation of the muse in reverse. And I think Whitman, as I said to you guys many times, I think Whitman's having a lot of fun playing these games, and this is one of those games, right? In other words, instead of asking the muse for help, the muse asks Whitman, before you go, will you please sing the song, chant the songs, right, of democracy victorious. And to that degree, it begs the question, and to be, do you think Leaves of Grass is in fact, in the end, the American epic poem? I've tried to make that argument here, and I'll continue to do so. I think that Whitman wants to be understood as the great American epic poet, right? Finally, at 3a, well, we've got all kinds of echoes going all the way back to the opening lines, including, obviously, all of our study of starting from Paumanok. We've mentioned Homer, we've also mentioned Plato's Republic, and that declension of state, that critique of democracy, the idea that, in fact, democracy can never work because everyone loses any sense of restrictions, and license is free to do whatever one wants. Whitman was astutely aware of the way in which Plato would make that argument about democracy, and yet still he's going to celebrate libertad and democracy. It'll be fun for us to go through this poem and just point out the ways in which Whitman continues to try to argue against that Platonic critique of democracy. Finally, at 3b, and how can we own this very first section? There's so many places we can go, but I'll challenge you with this thought. Do you think there is actually a soul of America? And do you think Whitman is somehow starting to capture it, and therefore our study of Leaves of Grass helps us to discover it with some power? I'm hopeful that our study of this poem will in fact do that for us as we now turn to sections 2 and following. Thank you.